A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, my friends, my all Muslim friends, and my friends, all the viewers who are watching this conversation from all over the world. We have been discussing neoliberalism for about a couple of days now. First of all, I would like to know how are you all? I'm hopeful that you will be fine. And today we are going to discuss another topic related to neoliberalism. We have already discussed some, 3 to 4 topics on neoliberalism. And today we are going to discuss how neoliberalism is related to and influences the foreign policy. Yes, the foreign policy of the world. It includes all the events that have been happening in the world, like, the war between, Israel and Palestine, and the Ukraine-Russia war, and so much. So we will see how neoliberalism influences the the politics, the culture, the society, religion, and so many different aspects. For that, we have invited Mr. Jon Kofas. He is a retired professor of history who specializes in international political economy. So please welcome Mr. Jon Kofas from Greece.
Thank you
How are
very
you, Mr.
much.
Kofas?
Thank you very much. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much again for inviting me. It's great to be with you once again. This is a very important topic because of the 2 simultaneous wars taking place right now, one in Ukraine, the other, of course, in Israel. Different types of war, because the one in Ukraine is indeed a conventional war between 2 armies. The one in Israel is hardly a conventional war, considering Israel has an army and an air force, and it is really bombarding civilians in Gaza. So it's a war, it's an asymmetrical war in that sense. However, foreign policy is very, very important, because war is indeed an extension of foreign policy. When diplomacy breaks down, then the next step is war. I want to start by pointing out that those people all over the world who go to college, go to university, and study and take courses in foreign affairs, foreign policy, whether it's political science or history courses in foreign policy. What they learn is that foreign policy is a reflection of a country's constitution. And theoretically, that is indeed true. And the Constitution is really the embodiment of the social contract. The social contract, of course, theoretically for democratic society is supposed to reflect the interests of the public. If the social contract reflects the interests of the public, then foreign policy is supposed to reflect the interests of the public. Now, that's in theory. In reality, just like the elites are responsible for making foreign policy, for making domestic policy, for determining domestic policy, economic policy, for example, trade policy, the influence in make domestic policy decisions comes from the elites. It doesn't come from the general public. The same thing is the case with foreign affairs. Foreign policy is really the domain of the elites. It is carried out to advance their interests. Now, by the elites, I mean political, military, and especially economic elites, which take precedence in neoliberalism over all others. I want to point out that the neoliberal foreign policy is not that different from foreign policy before the age of neoliberalism, before the 1980s. There is one element which distinguishes neoliberal foreign policy from pre-neoliberal foreign policy, and that is that geopolitics under neoliberalism, in other words, the pursuit of diplomatic relations, international relations, to determine the balance of power at the regional level as well as the international level, under neoliberalism, aims at having the geo-economic interests advanced. In other words, the goal of foreign policy is to gain market share on the, especially on the part of the great powers, but even the smaller countries do the exact same thing. Whether it is a smaller country or a larger country or a superpower like the United States and China, for example, the goal is the same. It's to advance the commercial interests. Now, the means that countries use differ insofar as what the abilities of those countries are. For example, the United States has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, China. They also have immense leverage in terms of their diplomatic relations with other countries, because they are trading partners, especially the United States and China, with so many countries, and that in itself is leverage. Now, neoliberal foreign policy, begins to change in the 1980s, which was a very important decade, because in the 1980s, many people, or maybe some remember, Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia introduces, in the Soviet Union then, of course, introduces glasnost and perestroika, the opening of Russia, the more democratization of Russia, which actually was a transition away from communism and into the market economy. The interesting thing about that era, the 1980s, when neoliberalism was taking root, first in England, then in the United States, and then it spreads gradually to the rest of the world, is that the Soviet Union and the entire communist bloc begins to give way, and finally, by the end of the early 1990s, it's the end of the Soviet bloc. And that coincides with the embryonic stage of neoliberalism. Simultaneously, what happens during that decade is that China is transitioning toward more opening, a greater opening toward the market economy. However, here's a very important point about why China pursued a different route than Russia and why these two countries have converged. China watched very carefully what happened to the Soviet Union. And what happened to the Soviet Union is the demise of communism. Yes, permitted the market economy to take over, but it also meant a very weak state structure. Now, this is something I want to talk about today because it has to do, and maybe we can do it at another session as well, It has to do a lot with the rise of China as a world economic power, um, and the gradual decline of the United States, but not just the United States, but the transatlantic powers, that is, the traditional Northwest European powers, which were, of course, historically, since NATO, the creation of NATO, the junior partners of the United States. The state as a catalyst in power relations, especially in foreign affairs, is very, very important. Um, but the point about the convergence of neoliberalism in the 1980s, early 1990s, and the end of communism in the Soviet bloc, and China's decision to go toward a more open market economy. However, in China's case, to retain the role of a strong state structure so that they don't meet the fate of Russia, which became very weak. It obviously, the Soviet Union was broken up completely. And in the 1990s, during the Yeltsin period, some people may remember the Yeltsin period. Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. Russia was actually a very weak state, and its fate rested very heavily on foreign advisors from the United States and Europe, who were advising Russia to adopt neoliberal policies, namely heavy privatization. Russia didn't have a private sector. All of a sudden, it created a private sector, but it was what kind of private sector did Russia have? They basically, the Kremlin privatized, they literally allocated contracts to favored individuals who became the oligarchs, namely the new billionaires and millionaires of Russia. Those were formerly public assets, and they had the power. Now, the Kremlin revived under Vladimir Putin, and the state structure regained some control, but the economy never did. Not nearly, and Russia is nowhere near where China is in terms of its economic role in the world stage. That's one dimension of how neoliberalism converges with the demise of the Soviet bloc and China's decision to adopt capitalism under state managed and state planning control. So it's a mixed economy for China to this day, by the way. The other dimension, of course, is what happens with the nature of neoliberal foreign policy. The United States in 1990 decided that this is the world order, as President George W. Bush, the first George Bush the senior, obviously his son became president later. He announced there was one world order, there was one superpower in the world, the United States. And sure enough, it was the US that determined the world order, what is called today, and this is related to Ukraine as well, the war in Ukraine as well as Israel, the rules-based world order, although we find out today these wars have exposed the so-called rules-based world order, that is really rules as defined by the United States and its junior partners, not in the interest of the rest of the world necessarily, and not based on terms favoring everyone, even in relations between the United States and Europe, actually, um, the Europeans found out when Trump was president, even those relations, but even today, even under Biden, were not based on mutual uh, interests converging. It was always with the U.S. as the hegemonic power, by the way. I want to make an overview point here about where the comparison between neoliberal foreign affairs on a world scale and how foreign affairs were conducted in another period, because a lot of scholars have in fact made this comparison, and I want to address it as well. I see, as a historian who had taught diplomatic history, as as well as China Western relations and U.S. European relations. I see this era of neoliberal foreign affairs on a world scale from the 1980s to the present very comparable as what took place in the world between the 1870s and the outbreak of World War I, 1914. That era in history is called the age of imperialism. What happened is the great powers, namely Japan, the United States, Western Europe, were going after markets and colonies and semi-colonies on a world scale. They carved up China, okay? They carved up Africa. And in the process, the Middle East, by the way, how can I forget? The Middle East. And in the process, they had small wars, what are called imperialist wars. The worst one of those was the Boer War in South Africa, and from 1899 to 1902. And what happened during that war, a great British scholar, John Hobson was his name, wrote a book after he took a look at that war, and he warned the world that if this war is really presaging, it's a signal that we may get into a global conflict down the road. And that's exactly what happens roughly a decade or so, a dozen years or so after John Hobson published the book. The world was in a global conflict because of what happened in South Africa. Namely, the South African War was about diamonds up in the Transvaal region. In other words, north of Johannesburg. Behind the Boers, the Dutch farmers up there, who were in control of the region where gold mines and diamond mines was really Germany. And Germany was calling the shots and encouraging the Dutch farmers not to give contracts to the British. And there was ultimately a war there. And really it was a proxy war behind which was Germany, and on the other side was Britain. And this sort of scenario, of course, we see in Ukraine with the proxy war between US-led NATO forces on the one side and Russia on the other. And Ukraine is a big prize. A lot of people don't realize in the 19th century, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine is an agriculturally rich country. And Ukraine is sort of divided. The eastern part, of course, historically has been pro-Russian. The western part, pro-European. But that conflict is, in fact, reminiscent. There are a lot of similarities. And Ukraine is really used as a pretext by the West, by Northwest Europe as well, especially the United States, to enter the Trans-Caspian region and expand NATO into Central Asia as a counterweight to both China and Russia. NATO has made no apologies that it wants to expand without limits, although that NATO was founded as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic. Asia has nothing to do with the North Atlantic. And by the way, it was founded right after Truman, shortly after Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, the beginning of the Cold War, to counter the expansion, assuming there would be expansion, of course, of communism. Okay, communism was over in 1990. There was no Soviet bloc. That withered away. The Soviet republics became independent countries. Russia became a federation. They were all pro-capitalist. The Warsaw Pact, that was a counterpart to NATO, was no more. But NATO continued. Not only did it continue, it expanded vastly. And then it continued to announce, and to this day, it makes the same claim that it wants global expansion. And the question is, what is the goal of this? Is it geopolitical? And the question is yes, but how does neoliberalism fit into this? Geopolitical for economic gains. The fact is that the United States wanted to be the primary provider of natural gas to Europe, especially to Germany. They had made, from Obama to Trump to Biden, they had made representations to Germany that they were against the Nord Stream gas line. They were against Russia supplying gas to Northwest Europe. They made no qualms about it. And when the Europeans said, where are we going to get the natural gas? This is the cheapest gas we can get. The answer was from us. Yes, but they were selling it for a lot more. The price for natural gas from the United States was enormous. They said, well, it's a national security issue. You can't get it from them because they can use it to blackmail you down the road. This had been ongoing until the goal was accomplished. And the goal to sell US, American natural gas to Northwest Europe was accomplished very simply by pushing the issue of NATO expansion and Ukraine coming into the fold and integrating much more with the West than the security interests of Russia permitted, that there was a war. Russia started the war. I'm going to make this very clear, by the way. Russia started the war. But it started the war because Russia felt that the national security and its sovereignty was threatened. I wrote my dissertation, by the way, ages ago, on the Crimean War. And this was in between 1854 and 1856. And Russia back then, different times back in the mid-19th century, had a similar issue like this one. They wanted access from the Black Sea into the Aegean down here, into the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were interested in making sure that um, that there were no obstacles to it. However, Western Europe, especially France and Britain, wanted to block them, and they went to war over it. And the British and the French won the war back then. However, they realized that it would be for the interests of the international community to allow the Russians to have that access, not to regiment them, that there was that the French and between the French and the British, there was Russia was not a problem in the mid 19th century. Militarily, they could easily, the French and the British navies were very powerful. They had proved that in the first Opium War. In 18, Britain had in the first Opium War in China in 1838. There was no problem with that. But the issue here is that the Russians historically, from the Crimean War to down to Stalin's Yalta Agreement, also Yalta is a resort in Crimea, by the way, in 1945 with Churchill and Roosevelt, where they agreed that the Soviet Union had to have a security zone, this hence the Eastern European corridor, which all became communist, all the Eastern European countries. To today, Ukraine, where Putin and the Russians say, well, we can't have NATO right next door because you're going to put nuclear warheads in Ukraine, and that threatens our national security. Now, for the US and the West, Ukraine is just a stepping stone for the Transcaucasus countries from Georgia and then on to Azerbaijan, and then Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and on to Mongolia. And this was their goal, gain all that market share, but to do it through geopolitical means. And this means the use of the military. I want to stop here and ask you if you, because I've been talking too much and this is an elaborate topic, and if you have any questions, because the next thing I want to address is, of course, how China ties into all of this. If
Okay,
yes.
Mr. Kofas. Okay, so from what you have said right now is that the U.S. wants, to be the, like we can say that U.S. wants to claim all the natural resources like, gas and oil, and we can also say that all the wars that it has inflicted on the Middle East, for example, the Iraq War, which was, which lasted for 8 years, and then so much on in Libya, and then and even the, the Israel and Palestine issue. All that we know, what we can understand is that it's all to gain access to natural resources like oil, gas, and so it can be a factor as well. So now you are going to talk about China. So how do you think that China benefits from this neoliberalism, and how uh, these things have impacted the global political circle?
China emerges as a player in the world stage gradually. They took a gradual approach. They did not. They were watching what Russia was doing in the 1980s and saw what happened in the 1990s with the Yeltsin period, with the Yeltsin regime. And what they saw in the 1990s, what happened to the Kremlin, sort of made them more cautious. The United States and the West wanted China not only to become a more market economy, which they did adopt a number of They did adapt capitalism. China is a capitalist economy. A lot of people keep saying, because it has one party state. The Communist Party is the dominant party, obviously, but the economy is capitalist. However, I used to tell my undergraduates and graduate students this. In the history of capitalism, if you look at capitalism as an umbrella in the last 500 years, there are all sorts of regimes that have existed under capitalism. Nazi Germany operated under capitalism, but then social democratic Norway today operates under capitalism. Absolutist France in the 18th century operated under capitalism, but so did industrialized England in the 18th century. Capitalism operates under different models. China adopted its own mix, where the state does in fact retain a major role in economic planning and determining economic policy without allowing the private sector, and especially billionaires. And China, by the way, has quite a few in the last 30 years. They've acquired a lot of those. Without allowing them to have the kind of power where they really call the shots on domestic and foreign policy the way that Western billionaires do. Where Western billionaires call the shots on everything from higher education to labor policy, to everything. They have enormous influence. This is not allowed in China. China has them under a short leash. They cooperate, they support them. By the way, I want to make sure that this point is made very clear. China is pro-capital. The Chinese government, the Communist Party, and in fact regiments the labor movement. I'll talk more about that. In fact, the Chinese labor movement is much more regimented than people realize, and China is, although it's a communist state, and you would think, because communism is based on the ideology of Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, you would think they would be much more pro-labor. They do have a social development policy, and they did eradicate extreme poverty. And in fact, this was a remarkable achievement considering where China was 30 years ago and what it is today. And obviously where it is headed also, where it's going. This is very, very important. And this is all due to the fact that they adopted a policy mix that has worked for them. Here's where I want to, because I developed this this thesis in my forthcoming book on neoliberalism. China actually used neoliberalism much more outside of its own borders, to its own advantage, than inside its own borders. In other words, it benefited immensely. And about a year and a half ago, if I recall, the Japanese finance minister pointed that out, that actually they are the ones who benefited from globalization, neoliberalism, taking advantage of the rest of the world that was under this model, while they, for themselves, had a policy mix that was quasi-statist. In other words, a developmentalist policy with a state structure that retained so many powers. And it's true. I mean, the Japanese finance minister was right. They did benefit from the neoliberal policies of the Russians. They took advantage of that, integrating the world through trade, while they, for themselves, that is, inside of China, and they did allow, by the way, foreign investment. I mean, most corporations, multinational corporations are within, from Apple to Mercedes-Benz to foreign investors that have gone in, have made enormous amounts of profits in China, without a doubt. And that's why they keep going to China, because there's a profit to be made in China. However, the state has a role in planning, in economic planning, the way the communists did the so-called 5-year plans, and the Chinese government has the last word on social engineering and economic engineering. They have not yielded policy powers to the private sector the way that the West has under neoliberalism. Under neoliberalism, the West has yielded to the private sector all those powers. From India, by the way, Modi, right, who has done this with people, billionaires supporting him, his regime. So he carves policies, he carves out, whether it's an agricultural policy or industrial policy, that benefit them, or in the United States or in Germany. So the Chinese model is a mixed model. China benefited enormously in the 1990s with the fact, this is during when, especially when Clinton was president, he was pushing for more bilateral relations. And then, of course, they benefited because they joined the World Trade Organization. I believe it was in 2002, if I haven't written down, but I think it was in 2002. And China became a member of the World Bank, a member of the IMF. It observed international trade rules. Its ultimate goal under neoliberalism was to integrate as much of the world economy as possible. And of course, the BRICS group, which of course is very famous today for the fact that the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS group has a GDP, combined GDP, which is higher than the G7. And it's easily going to outpace the G7 in the future, easily. And this is not, and I have read some Western accounts, because for the last 10 or 12 years or so, you constantly read in the Western media, China is doomed, China is over, economic miracle is over. And of course, this is, the empirical data shows something very different every year, including 2023, the statistics were out. Chinese GDP was 5.3 annual growth for 2023. The US was less than half that. And yet, the Western press announced that 5.3 was horrible, but the 2.5 in the US was a miracle. So there's a lot of propaganda about what the Chinese economy is doing, and the reality. If it was so horrible, then why are so many countries lined up to join BRICS? And why are Western investors themselves going to China? And why is it that the big corporations, including the United States corporation, Microsoft, Bill Gates is a big fan, for example, going to China because Apple, because they make money in China. China is a moneymaker. But there is a trend, and this is where neoliberal foreign policy comes in, and this is where the clash and the contradictions begin to set in, because I want to develop this point as well. By 2014, something happens that's very, very important, and that is that GDP of China measured in PPP terms. PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity. And the IMF and the World Bank and a lot of other organizations use that, because this is actually the purchasing power parity is the real measure, not the nominal GDP. In nominal GDP, China was way back, further down, number 2 to the US. It had already surpassed Japan, by the way. I think it was 2011 that it surpassed Japan. And it was now second to the US. By 2014, it surpasses the US. And it's way ahead of the US today. In GDP purchasing power parity terms, which is the real measure. Coincidentally, in 2014, when China surpasses, Obama issues the first warning to the world about, and to the United States, that we got to watch out here because China is surpassing us. We have to adopt a foreign policy. And this is where you get the beginning of a much more aggressive foreign policy. It starts with Obama and then it intensified with Trump, and it continues with Biden. They warned that Obama was the first one, that if they overtake us, they will make the rules. Now, I want everyone to think about this. They will determine the rules of the world trade system. What they were really saying is that whoever carves out the rules has the advantage. I used to work with an ex-CIA agent, and he used to tell me, he used to ask me if I knew what the golden rule was, and I would say, what is the golden rule? Whoever, and he would reply as a joke, whoever. In fact, he was stationed out, I think, somewhere in the Middle East when he was with the CIA. Whoever owns the gold, has the gold, makes the rules, and that's what Obama was saying. The economic power is the basis of all power. It's the basis of superpower status. Now, in terms of, to put it in a methodological setting here, in terms of status, the fact is that China is the largest manufacturing country in the world. It has the largest trade base in the world. It trades more than, in terms of value and volume, than any country in the world. It is going to overtake the United States in nominal value as well, because right now it's only in purchasing power parity, power value. But it's going to take in nominal value, it's going to take maybe another 7 to 10, maybe a dozen years, but it will exceed US GDP. And eventually India will overtake the United States, and the US will be number 3, with Indonesia number 4. According to all forecasts, by the way, by major organizations like the IMF, World Bank, they all agree on this, that the United States collapsed to number 3, right above Indonesia. So China is really at that level. The question for the United States as the heart of neoliberalism and the heart of Western capitalism is, what can we do about this? They went back to old Cold War strategies, and we're now in a new Cold War. The solution on the part of the United States was, let's use the only leverage we have: defense, the military sector. There was a guy during the Trump period, I believe his name is Eldridge Colby, who worked for the Pentagon, and he developed a theory called the Colby thesis, which was, okay, we can't compete with them. At least let's stop them. Let's slow them down, if not stop them. How can we do that? Destabilize. Where can we destabilize? South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, Sea of Japan. Let's form alliances, go back to the old Cold War strategy of containment, containing them, get as many countries in the Pacific as possible to back us up and contain China. And at the same time, as you know, as everybody knows, during the Trump period, there were sanctions, there were tariffs. They tried just about everything, especially on a specific product. And this is where neoliberalism comes in, because it was all about economic advantage, semiconductors. And they went after Huawei. I know I'm mispronouncing the huge electronics communications telephone company, cell phone company, which, by the way, a company which, despite all the sanctions and all the problems and all the harassment, the company is so well managed. I mean, they spend at least 25% of the revenue on research and development. So it's no surprise that this company, but the Chinese government, which cooperates with the company, as well as other semiconductors, the chips war has now tilted in China's favor. And the reason actually is because the US imposed tariffs and sanctions on them, forcing China to reevaluate its industrialization policy to support more its own companies, whereas they were buying the equipment from American companies. And that is really racing. It means that their own companies are racing ahead of the United States, much to the disappointment of those who thought that sanctions and tariffs will slow them down and so forth. This, of course, brings us to the military issue, that is arming Taiwan to the teeth. The fact is, the U.S., I mean, China, this goes back to the Mao era. China would never have agreed to have anything to do with the United States unless they agreed to the one China policy. The one China policy means Taiwan is part of China. At the very least, stay out of it. Let that issue be determined by them. The United States, historically, I have to tell you, in foreign affairs, has always considered itself both an Atlantic and a Pacific power, because when you look at the map of the United States, on either side, you have on the eastern side, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side, the western side, you have the Pacific. And of course, they have the 50th state, the Hawaiian Islands, the 50th state of the United States. So the United States has always considered itself an Atlantic and a Pacific power. Therefore, it lays claim to the Pacific just as it lays claim to the Atlantic as well as the Caribbean. So it considers itself a hemispheric power, that is the Western Hemisphere from Canada all the way down to Argentina. It considers itself a Pacific power, an Atlantic power, and so it doesn't want to yield anything to China. So you have here basically a power struggle of immense proportions. And what happens in Ukraine is really a small manifestation of that. And the realization on the part of American policymakers is that they can't do this unless they go back to an old Cold War strategy where they reduce the Europeans into junior partner status, which they have, by the way, by now, and much to the regret of the Europeans. And since I live in Europe, I can tell you many of them, and I'm in contact especially with a lot of German colleagues, they know this more, especially my German colleagues, more than anyone. They feel that they sort of have been duped into this new realignment, new relationship. And they have all the risk, by the way, because in case of, God forbid, knock on wood, as they say, of some nuclear accident, because hopefully no one will intentionally go into nuclear war, they're right there. I mean, they're going to be, they're going to be the first ones hit. So this is for the Europeans, it's going back to the early Cold War, where they were this junior partner, basically a pillar for the United States, helping the U.S. goals on a world scale. And that's not exactly where the European Union had ambitions of its own to become a good rival and competitor of the United States, not to be its junior partner again. The Ukraine war has reduced it to that. The Ukraine war, which was remains, it hasn't ended, which remains a geopolitical struggle on the surface, is really about geoeconomic interests, market share, dominance from the Ukraine stretching into Central Asia and containing the Russians. Russia, by the way, I haven't said much about Russia, although I used to teach Russian history. Russia is very rich in natural resources. It's self-sufficient, it's a vast country, self-sufficient in everything. Siberia, very rich in mineral resources, diamonds, gold, iron. A lot of those contracts, since the U.S. was behind Ukraine, a lot of those contracts, China sought the opportunity to grab some of those contracts, signed on long-term contracts for Siberian mineral exploration. So this is really a world struggle for natural resources and markets, which, by the way, I remember years and years, my God, back in Chicago, when I was in graduate school, there was a book published and became very popular back in the late 70s, The Global Struggle for Minerals. And it was about the early Cold War, that it was really and it was an American scholar who wrote the book. He saw the whole Cold War issue not so much in terms of nuclear weapons, which they were at the surface but never used. Nuclear weapons are made not to be used. They're a deterrent. They're not to be used. If they're used, it's over. And he viewed the whole Middle East issue in terms of access to oil. Not that the U.S. has a lot of oil. However, it wanted to deny that access to oil to its rivals, right? Obviously, the question is, has the neoliberal strategy, or has the neoliberal goal been fulfilled of using geopolitics, using the military leverage in geopolitics to achieve geoeconomic goals? And the answer is that it has not. And for a very simple reason. Both the United States and Japan, more than anyone else, more than the Europeans, have admitted that globalization and neoliberalism have actually helped China, and that they now need to reevaluate the issue of regional blocks. So the IMF, which is as pro-status quo, pro-neoliberal, as well as the World Bank, of course, admit that where we are today is in a fragmented world economically, back into blocks. Now, what? Because neoliberalism is supposed to do just the opposite. It is supposed to create a one world economy, a seamless world economy. China is doing that through the Bricks and Road initiative, which has most of the countries in the world behind it. There are, I think, 35 or 45. I can't remember exactly. Most of the countries in the world are behind, are somehow involved, directly or indirectly, in the Belt and Road Initiative of China. China has integrated much of the world economically, including its rivals, the United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It has included Japan. Forget about Japan. Japan does big business in China. Japan needs China. Taiwan that the United States wants to use as leverage against China. If people only knew, they talk about Taiwan going against China. China at any time can choke off Taiwan because nearly 40% of the trade of Taiwan, that island country, is conducted with the mainland and Hong Kong. Just that alone gives you an idea. If you're that dependent on the mainland and Hong Kong, trade-wise, you know that that's your lifeline. It's almost half the trade of the country. In any case, the black trading is back, and it's back because the neoliberal foreign policy has backfired, just like the foreign policy of the United States and NATO, which was intended to choke off Russia, to undermine Russia economically, to have them come begging the West on its feet. The fact is, Russia's economy has done just fine in the last 2 years, especially in 2023. When Vladimir Putin was told what the economic numbers were for 2023, he was ecstatic. He couldn't believe it. The fact is that the military leverage to achieve geoeconomic goals has backfired, and it has created contradictions, namely undermine neoliberalism because economic nationalism now is back in much greater force. And again, I don't know how much time we have if you wanna end this, but it has, by so doing, it has invited authoritarianism from Russia to India, to Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, to Hungary under Viktor Orban. You have basically economic nationalism. Even liberal countries that are pluralistic and cling on to, at least in rhetoric, democracy and democratic rhetoric. We have seen the results of democracy, of course, in the Middle East. You know, they claim to be defenders of freedom and democracy, but we have seen the results of this, especially with Israel going in Gaza with the mass killings of innocent civilians, supposedly in the hunt of Hamas. But in the meantime, it's the civilians who are getting killed. So what we have is economic nationalism remaining a very powerful force on a world scale, by the way. Because what happens is a lot of people, and we see this in the 19th century as well, a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that when one country, let's say the United States, super nationalistic as it was under Trump, especially flag waving, America first, if you remember, a lot of people might remember Trump era, America first and all that. That actually stimulates, it makes other people, first of all, the immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico, but actually people, rivals in the United States as well as competitors, sort of guarded as well. So they become nationalistic. So it has a ripple effect. It has a global effect. Nationalism has a global effect. If one country, especially a powerful country, goes that route, then it pulls others along with it. Okay, Assad, I'm going to pause here and ask. I know I've been talking. I'm sorry, I've been talking too long. Do you have anything that this is a very elaborate topic. An encyclopedia could be written about. I'm sorry that it's so. You know, we haven't even said anything about Latin America. Or, you know, they're all of, for example, Mexico and Brazil, which very important countries, Argentina.
Well, Mr. Kofas, it's great to listen to you. You are sharing so much important information that, a layman or an average person doesn't have, and even people don't pay attention to all these things. And even if they do, they don't know how to, conduct research on that and, uh, develop a narrative on all these events happening in the world. Mr. Kofos, you just said that there is a Cold War going on, and the US has been trying to slow down China, if not stop it from progressing. There are some instances, and I would like to know your perspective on that. That you said that in 2014, China began progressing and it surpassed the US in GDP and PPP. And China is still ahead of the US. In that same year, a very well documented event happened and it's still ongoing, and that is the Uyghur genocide.
Yes,
China imprisoned Uyghurs in the internment camps, and it has received a lot of criticism from all over the world, especially the US. US has been at the forefront of criticisms on China and accusing it of war crimes against the Uyghurs in these camps. And there is another thing that we discussed, when we were discussing neoliberalism and social media. That was the censorship of TikTok in the United States and the censorship of YouTube in China. YouTube is based in the US, China banned it. Uh, TikTok is based in China, US bans it. So, do you see these events as, part of the Cold War between these two countries?
yes, I see them, and I'm glad. First of all, Assad, I want to thank you for bringing up the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in the northwest of China. A very important topic. I'm glad you brought that up about 2014. 2014, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what happens. It's no secret that when Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai took over in China, one of the things they went after, one of the institutions they went after was religion. Just like Vladimir Lenin went after religion in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. Both Mao and Lenin went after religion. It's no secret that the minority population in the Northwest province up there has had a history of discrimination. That's true. It is also true that the United States, Australia, and a number of other Western countries criticized China for how it treats its Muslim population. A number of scholars in the West, as well as Muslim scholars, asked, why is it that there is a cherry-picking approach to human rights? Granted, the Uyghurs have every right not to be persecuted, to be treated, they're a minority population, they're Muslims, right? To be treated fairly like all citizens. Fine, good enough. Now, where is the outrage on the exact same issue when it comes to Palestinians? Not only is there no outrage, as you know, as the world knows, Northwest Europe and the United States and Canada have been supporting Israel, not just diplomatic cover in the UN, but military and financial support, especially the United States. So the Muslims in the Northwest province in China are good Muslims. The Palestinian Muslims are not good Muslims. The Muslims in Northwest, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province are deserving of human rights, but not the Palestinians for 75 years, right? So the double standard in US foreign policy, in Western foreign policy, is very obvious. They just recently, to punish the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and the United Nations, they just recently, a number of Western countries led by the United States, cut aid to the UN agency providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, especially in Gaza where they need it most. That was punishment. So they have the audacity to talk about the Uyghurs in the Northwest province in China. You see, this is the problem. If you have a consistent policy of supporting universal human rights all over the world, without exceptions, human beings are human beings, period. Without exceptions, fine. But if you're going to start saying, oh, we support this human rights policy, but not the rights of the human rights of these people, but not of those people. And you know when this started, I'll tell you, because I'm old enough to remember this stuff. I remember when I was in graduate school, and Jimmy Carter, who I believe was a great president, if you compare him with a lot of the rest of them, by the way. Jimmy Carter comes along and he introduces a human rights component to his foreign policy. And guess what happened? He started cherry picking human rights. Back then, you know who the target was? The communist bloc countries. You know where a lot of human rights abuses back then were taking place? In South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was in prison. So The question is, you want to follow human rights as a component of your foreign policy? That's wonderful. That's very commendable. Do it across the board. Human rights for all humanity, not for specific foreign policy agendas because you have a rival and you want to undermine the rival in Beijing. That's my comment on that issue. Now, you also raised the question of a new Cold War. We are in a new Cold War. The United States, no one disagrees with it. The United States is the first one to admit we're in a new Cold War. The question is, where is it going? The U.S. spent, depending whose figures you believe, between 5 and 7.5 trillion in the last 20 years in wars, from occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. And then they got up this president who is engaged in this high-risk business. And it just started yesterday or a couple of days ago. I think it was yesterday. They started bombing yesterday. They started bombing targets in Iraq and Syria, Iranian supposedly targets, much to the dismay of both the governments in Iran and Syria, in Iraq and Syria. The fact is, this president cut and ran out of Afghanistan. For 20 years, the U.S. was in Afghanistan. What was it doing in Afghanistan? Chasing Al-Qaeda. Chasing Al-Qaeda, supposedly, right? What did he gain out of that? The source of Al-Qaeda was Saudi Arabia. Everybody knows it. It's no secret. There were legal cases that the U.S. government tried to sit on and did sit on against Saudi Arabia, by the way. Osama bin Laden was from a very prominent family, the Saudi family. The issue of Cold War is used as leverage for containment, and in the Middle East specifically, it's destabilization. A number of years ago, I wrote an article, and I think it was published in India, in a journal in India, about the destabilization policy of that the U.S. has been pursuing on a sustained basis in the Middle East. And that policy, the destabilization policy, helps to stabilize only one country, Israel, at the expense of the rest. In the meantime, what happens is the U.S. corporations, especially the energy sector, and the defense sector, gain enormously. Saudi Arabia, until the rapprochement that China finally brokered between the Saudis and the Iranians, promising, obviously, from behind the scenes, as we now know, that China would bring them both in BRICS, in the BRICS group, right? Until then, Saudi Arabia was just buying weapons right and left, spending billions in buying U.S. weapons, fighting proxy wars from Yemen to Syria. And this, again, the war, this destabilizing the entire Middle East, having tense relations between Saudi Arabia and China benefited the United States corporations. They were sending weapons. They were selling weapons to the Saudis. But they weren't doing anything for the civilian economies of the Middle East. The defense sector is parasitic. The defense sector sucks up resources from the civilian sector, because if you're going to spend money over here in this sector, that means you're depriving it from somewhere else. So the new Cold War, what has the new Cold War done for the Europeans? The fact is, Europe is a mess. There are farmers everywhere, from down here, from Greece and the Balkans, all the way to Germany and Western Europe and France. There are farmers out in the streets with their tractors and trucks, and they are complaining about living standards. They're complaining that the defense budgets are taking money away that could have been going to them, money because farm subsidies have been cut, costs have gone up. The price that the farmer is getting is nothing in comparison to what the retail consumer is paying. The fact is that the neoliberal business, the neoliberal foreign policy, which is all about business, maximizing profit, comes at a cost. The cost is to the working class, to the middle class. They pay a price. Obviously, the worst price of all is when there is hot war, when there's actual war. Those poor people in Ukraine, and of course, what is happening to the Palestinian people. Even worse, the Palestinians don't even have an army. They're just helpless. It's a tragedy to see children, that many children, killed, injured, and left without parents. Their parents have been killed. That's just a tragedy. For what? For this mythology of a Zionist state, and behind that, who benefits? Even within that Zionist state, there's only a handful of people that benefit, and those are the people with the money, the people, the capital. The Zionist state doesn't help the Israeli worker. The Israeli worker has no benefit from a Zionist state. This is a front. This is an ideology that's thrown out there to justify and to distract the public, from what is happening in the social contract, which is a neoliberal social contract, is maximize profit, maximize the wealth of the very few, but it comes at the expense of the rest, and then you get destabilization. Destabilization leads to authoritarian policies, by the way, because then the state responds with force. And militarism itself is a distraction. Military involvement is a distraction. The best way to unify a country and to distract from domestic problems and their issues is to go to war. This is as early as the ancient times, from the Persian wars with the Athenians to the present. Wars unify people. People rally around the flag. And their problems seem small by comparison. There's a national crisis going on. Although those small problems are the ones that government should be attending to, not creating conflict and destabilization. So that's where we're at.
Okay, from what you said, we can just analyze that the U.S. Is a proponent of the human rights violations, or the safety of human rights, and enacting and providing the basic human rights to people, where it has its own interests. For example, the Ukraine issue, it has rivalry with the China, so it criticizes it for the Uyghur genocide, and it has issues with Russia, so it criticizes the war with Ukraine. But when it comes to Palestine, it has alliance with Israel, so we can say that it supports it. Well, Mr. Kofas, speaking of this alliance with Israel, I was just listening to a podcast, and there was a guest. His name was Awadh Oja from India. He presented his own perspective on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. He said that it is not a concern of religion. It has never been a religious conflict between, the Israel and Palestine. It has never been that. It's actually a geopolitical, you know, purpose for imposing the state of Israel in Palestine. Actually, what Awadh Oja said was that the U.S. wanted to control the trade of the East and the West. The US wanted its control on the eastern and western world, so it thought that Palestine was a very important region from which it could control east and western trade. But the US could not directly control Palestine. It could not directly rule over Palestine, so it uh, imposed the state of Israel as its representative on Palestine. What is your perspective on that?
Well, the historically speaking, the fact is, when in 1948, when uh, the Zionist rebels, because they were rebels, they went in. The Palestinians, they went into Palestine, by the way, the mandate of Palestine. The Palestinians welcomed European Jews who were fleeing. Nobody wanted European Jews. The Palestinian people welcomed them. They took them in. Then they rebelled in the 1940s. And in 1948, they prevailed and decided to create their own state, the state of Israel. And the two countries, the first two countries that recognized them, and they both recognized them for different reasons, although one of them, as we'll see, was obviously way off on this. The first country was the Soviet Union, actually, that recognized them, technically speaking, and the second was the US. The Stalin at the time was concerned that the Arabs were too close to the West. They were vassals of the West. They were stooges of the West. So he didn't quite trust them. So he recognized Israel, assuming that it would be on the Soviet side. He was wrong, obviously. The US recognized Israel immediately, also after Stalin, after the Soviet Union. The US recognizes Israel because it didn't quite trust the Arabs either. It wanted, this was 1 year. President Truman recognized Israel in 1948. A year before that, President Truman, in March 1947, he promulgated the Truman Doctrine, which declared that Iran, Turkey, and Greece, that those three countries, which if you look on the map, they form a corridor and a sort of a strategic buffer zone. And to the north of that, again, you have to look at a map of 1948, not a map of today. But what when you look at that map, the 1947 map and 1948, it's the same. What you see is a strategic buffer zone that Truman and his advisors were thinking of in making sure that above that, communism stays away, and that corridor protects the everything south of that. And what was very important back then, to very very entrenched interests, including the Rockefeller family and other oil companies. The Rockefellers, of course, were very heavily invested in oil back then, was the Middle Eastern oil fields. So the U.S. was interested not just in the Iranian, but in the whole region, oil fields. He was interested in the oil fields. Israel is there as a state that the United States recognizes and then immediately cultivates deep relations with Israel and has been the #1 supporter of Israel historically. During the Suez Canal crisis, by the way, 1956, with Nasser, when Nasser was in charge, in Egypt, the fact is that the U.S. deviated from the schemes between Israel and Europe. But the fact is that the United States has been the #1 foreign aid provider to Israel and the #1 diplomatic supporter to Israel in the United Nations, which is very important, providing that cover that Israel needs in the United Nations, because the U.S. is a member of the Security Council, one of the 5 permanent members. So it provides that it has veto power in the Security Council and provides that cover that Israel needs. It's no secret. It is no secret that there are pro-Israel elements historically, and especially in the last, I would say, 40 years, in other words, during the Neoliberalism era, which are the pro-Israel elements which are in government, in media, in Wall Street, in academia, in think tanks. These are very important in foreign policy as well. A lot of the neoconservatives in this administration, the Biden administration, are pro-Israel, unfortunately. And these neoconservatives are advocates of militarism as leverage to geoeconomic goals. So you use militarism, military solutions, by the way. Those who study foreign affairs and diplomatic history and diplomacy in universities know that war is the last resort. It's not the first thing you do. It's the last thing you do when you don't have any other choice. But these people jump at military solutions as leverage for geoeconomic goals, precisely because of what the Eldridge Colby thesis is, which is, well, we're not going to prevail, let's face it, over China economically. So we have to use the only leverage we have, which is military means. That's what we have, that's what we're going to use. And by the way, that was very effective for a long time during the Cold War. However, now there's a different dynamic. During the Cold War, Russia was a superpower in the military sense, not in an economic sense. China is a superpower in an economic sense, not necessarily in a military sense. Actually, Russia has more nuclear weapons, more nuclear warheads than any country in the world. The US is second, China is way down. China has not focused on defense. China is focused on economic integration on a world scale. China wants to be the economic superpower. And people who have studied economic history and military affairs and foreign affairs know that the economy is the basis of everything else. In other words, you can't be a military power if you're not an economic power. If you're going to try that, you will face eventually ruin. You can't sustain the military power status if you don't have an economic base, a strong economic base to sustain that power. So that's my view.
Okay, Mr. Kofas, the questions are finished on my part. If there is any final message that you want to convey to the viewers, and if you propose a solution to the entire issue, you can present it. And if there is anything in this topic, if there was any important aspect that I may have forgotten to ask you, you can share that as well.
I do want to point out that the history has shown us that military solutions do not work. The fact is that military solutions lead to destruction and to consequences beyond the immediate players, especially in a world economy that is so well integrated. The entire world pays the price for militarism in a small region, whether it's Israel or Ukraine. The whole world pays. When the war in Ukraine erupted, Sub-Saharan Africa especially complained that the price of grain, because Ukraine and Russia are major suppliers, the price of grain and the price of foodstuffs in general went up. The neoliberal foreign policy of the West, US NATO group, of using military means to achieve geoeconomic goals, geoeconomic advantages, because China's rise to globalism has proved so far destructive. So in my view, what they need to do is ask themselves, where is this going? What are they going to achieve with all of this? In my estimation, when I look at the public debt of the United States rising in the last 20 years to the levels that it has, chasing that of Japan. Japan, by the way, is the largest, has the largest public debt in the world, and the U.S. is running to catch up with it. When I look at the public debt of the United States, when I look at living standards, what I see in the United States, but also in Western Europe, what I see is that militarism as a strategy is not achieving any goals. It's to the detriment. It is to the detriment, not just of the parties directly concerned, but it has reverberations across the globe. People who are completely innocent. Why should someone in Ethiopia be paying more for wheat? Because there is a proxy war by NATO and the US in Ukraine. There could have been a diplomatic solution, by the way, to that war. The one in Israel with Gaza, that is an outrage. I remember very vividly the picture of Biden going on a plane, taking his, the US presidential jet, going to Tel Aviv and embracing Bibi Netanyahu. Instead of saying, let's sit down and make sure there's no conflict here, let's resolve this issue through diplomatic means, for the best interest, the welfare of the Palestinian people, who have obviously been the minority population under exploitative terms for 75, more close to 76 years now, right? So this is an important issue. When diplomacy can easily be a substitute, deliberately choosing military means to solve problems that can be solved diplomatically is utterly destructive for all parties concerned, not just the ones directly involved. And that's the last thing I wanted to say about it.
Okay, I'm extremely thankful to all the viewers who have been watching this video and listening to this conversation. It's very important, viewers. I request you all to please pay attention to all these things that we have discussed in this video. You know, the world is in deep trouble at this moment. We are already seeing, we have already discussed the Uyghur genocide, the Ukraine war, the conflict in Palestine. We have discussed that all in this video. We have been discussing it for 90 minutes now, but these issues have been ongoing for so many years. So many innocent civilians have lost their lives. Children have been deprived of growing up and living to the and growing up as adults and living a practical life. Parents have lost their children. Children have been orphaned, and the world is in deep trouble, and it's just because people some people want to protect their political and economic goals. They want to prosper in terms of money, power, and they want to occupy natural resources, and they can go to any extent to fulfill their goals. So I'm extremely thankful to all the viewers. Please share your opinions in the comment section, and please share this video with all of your connections, with your contacts, with your friends and family. And I'm also thankful to Mr. Jon Kofas from Greece for sharing this information from and taking time from his precious time. And we are hopeful that we will be back soon with more topics related to neoliberalism and other philosophies as well. And I also want to tell all of you that Mr. Kofas has written so many books related to his subject of international political economy, and we will try to share reviews of his books. We will discuss his books as well in the future. So
Thank you.
I'm thankful to Mr. Kofas. Thank you. I'm thankful to viewers, and thank you for your time. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.